So if you take the Earth as a whole, if you look at all of the land on Earth, it is worth remembering that more than 10% of all the land on Earth is Russia. Russia is enormous. It is physically enormous, physically the largest nation on Earth. And it's not even close. Russia is more than 6.5 million square miles of land, more than 6.5 million. No other country on Earth is more than 4 million square miles. It's just massive. I mean, we're a big country, too. We have, 4 time zones coast to coast. Russia has 11 time zones. And yet, despite that massive size, Russia has a teeny tiny little sclerotic backwards economy. They're the biggest country on Earth. They've got an economy considerably smaller than Italy's. In terms of population, nominal GDP per capita, Russia's not just worse off than like us or Italy or any other country in Western Europe. Russia is way below like Romania, way below Panama. They're economically worse off than the Maldives and Palau per capita GDP. And, yes, Russia has had the luck to be sitting on lots of oil and gas. They have a totally non-competitive, unmodernized, technologically backward oil and gas industry to show for it. But that's really all they have in terms of an economy. I mean, literally their entire economic output is oil and gas. And even so, their oil and gas sector is so lame that whenever they want to do something more complicated than sticking a straw into the ground in Siberia, they have to find some Western oil company to come in and build the technology for them to do it. The one thing they have, they barely even have. Russia is a country with immense resources. And the Russian people have a record of cultural and scientific achievement that any country on Earth would kill for. And yet, their leaders have taken that potential and just shredded it. Russia, under its current leadership, has devolved into a kleptocratic dictatorship where, yes, technically there's a parliament, there's the Russian Duma, but really exists in name only. It's just basically an extension of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And yes, technically there is a judiciary in Russia, but also in name only. It is also just an extension of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And yes, technically, barely, but technically there are elections in Russia, but that fiction doesn't even really extend to in name only at this point, since Putin now just declares opposition candidacies and opposition parties to be illegal. So the people of Russia today are remarkably ill-served by their increasingly isolated, aging dictator who has over 20 years in power under his belt already. He's got plans for 20 more. He has no plan for a successor, and apparently no plan to release Russia from the suffocating hold that he has on that beleaguered country and the fates of its 144 million people. He has reduced his country to one that exports, I said they only have one export. Really, they have two. They export oil and gas, and they export organized crime. Great. And now with each passing year, the world becomes increasingly capable of saying no, at least to the oil and gas that he's selling. So what does he have left? What else can he do? For months now, the United States has been warning, overtly, publicly, that Russian President Vladimir Putin was massing all those troops on the Ukrainian border for a reason, that it wasn't for military exercises and it wasn't for any other reason. He was planning to invade. He was not only planning to invade, he was planning a large-scale invasion, a full-scale invasion with the aim of taking over Ukraine. The United States has been warning about that explicitly for months. Also for months, Russia has been denying it. Denying they would ever even consider such a thing. The ambassador denying it, the foreign minister denying it, members of the Russian Duma denying it, presenters on Russian state-run television denying it. Oh, how ridiculous for the United States to say such a provocative thing that we plan to invade Ukraine. How ridiculous, how hilarious, of course not. You can put that in your file to refer to if you ever forget in the future whether or not Russian government pronouncements should be taken as if they mean something. They've spent months denying this would happen, and now, of course, it has happened. The U.S. government even publicly released intelligence about what kinds of false pretexts, what kind of fake stories Russia was planning to make up about Ukraine to create a fake justification for why they needed to invade. The United States said in advance, hey, Russia's going to make up some fake nonsense about there being mistreatment of Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. They're going to make up something about that, about how they need to send in troops to rescue all these people who are being victimized somehow because the Ukrainian government is hurting its citizens somehow. The U.S. government warned in advance that this is what Russia would make up, that this is what they would claim to purportedly justify their invasion. And then sure enough, like clockwork, that is exactly what Russia did. They announced war on Ukraine, saying that Russian troops were only entering because they needed to. It was forced upon them. They needed to step in as peacekeepers to stop some mythical crimes being committed by the Ukrainian government against Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the eastern part of that country. It is a baldly false pretext, and it is one that we knew to expect. It's not the real reason Putin invaded. Why did Putin invade? Why is he doing this? Why is this happening? Well, if you were the kleptocratic dictator sitting on top of a country that you were keeping poor and unhappy and backward with no plans to do anything but more of that for another few decades, how would you feel about a big, culturally similar neighboring country where your population and their population had lots of family ties, lots of connection, lots of overlap, lots of reason to identify with one another. And in that large, culturally similar neighboring country, they recently threw out the pro-Russia puppet leader that you had installed there. They took economic steps to ally themselves with Europe more than with you. They then elected by a huge margin a popular Russian-speaking guy who wants ties with the West and Europe and the United States. A new, young, charismatic leader who said the night he was elected that everybody in the former Soviet states should look at his election and know that anything is possible, even in the former Soviet world, thanks to democracy. How does that look to you if you're Vladimir Putin? From the corner that Vladimir Putin has painted himself into, in the country he has ruined, the threat posed by a free, democratic, Western-minded, modern Ukraine, that's like a skeleton hand that might grab you by the ankle if you let your foot drift too far off the edge of the bed at night. Yes, it's true. Russian President Vladimir Putin has delusions about being a new czar and remaking the Russian Empire and reconstituting the USSR. Sure. Fine. But also, outside of the fairy tale books, he also just can't let any country near him work in a way that might indicate to the Russian people that they too ought to expect their country and their government to work for them. He needs his neighboring countries to be dependent on him, to be corrupt, and to be fundamentally disappointing to their people. That's what he needs from the near abroad, from his neighboring countries. And from the far abroad, for us in the West, he would please prefer us to be disunified, destabilized, and as disreputable as he can possibly make us. I mean, there's a reason why Russia has been spending all of this time not only trying to upend the international Western-led order, but he's specifically spending all of this time and energy supporting extremist and racist and separatist and otherwise destabilizing movements inside Western countries. From France to the UK to us in the United States. Really, I mean, it's not like he's doing a lot constructive in the world, but he's spending a lot of energy, a lot of resources, is taking a lot of risks to do anything he can to seed, basically, dislocation, disreputability, corruption, and the inability to perform as a democracy anywhere he can in the Western world, particularly in the countries that lead the West. He wants disunity and disarray anywhere else in the world. He wants disunity and disarray in the West in particular. And nearby, he wants and needs not a sphere of influence, but a sphere of insulation around his own poorly run, shambolic nation. A sphere of insulation for himself and for what he's done to his country. A sphere in which the governments of those other nearby nations also suck. Leaders that also don't serve their people, that answer to him, that are corrupt and manipulable, and they offer nothing to their people. Anything other than that, anything better than that, and the Russian people might start getting ideas about what their country should be like, too. If a government nearby to Russia proves to be anything other than a shambolic disgrace, well, they've got to go. And so Russia has started another war. One of the rough truths of kleptocracy, of being a kleptocratic dictator, is that even very poor nations can produce very rich kleptocrats, right? Even a very poor country, if the guy at the top steals everything, the guy at the top's still going to be very rich. You don't need a well-off country to make a well-off thief. Sanctions that impose economic pain on Russia will ultimately impose no economic pain on him. He will stay one of the richest men to have ever walked the face of the earth, no matter how much the rest of the Russian economy and the Russian people suffers. And does he care about economic pain for his people? Well, he doesn't really have to. As long as he can sustain the dictatorship, he's not susceptible to any democratic consequences from his own people's unhappiness. I mean, what are they going to do? Vote him out? Look, though, this was, I think, a piece of this today that nobody could have predicted with confidence. Look at the protests against what Putin did today inside Russia. Look at this. This is St. Petersburg, Russia today. Look at all those people. Russian authorities put out dire warnings today, threatening the Russian people that anybody demonstrating, anybody protesting, anybody saying anything against Putin's invasion of Ukraine would be treated as a rioter, would essentially be treated as a terrorist. But look at the people turning out in St. Petersburg, in Moscow. I mean, here's the lead story tonight in the Associated Press. Dateline Moscow. Shocked Russians turn out by the thousands today to decry their country's invasion of Ukraine as emotional calls for protests grew on social media. Some 1,745 people in 54 different Russian cities were arrested today. 54 different Russian cities? At least 957 arrests today in Moscow alone. The Russian people have no say in the behavior of their government under the Putin dictatorship. He has criminalized standing against him in elections. He's criminalized even journalism about him. He has criminalized human rights work. He has criminalized history. He has criminalized all protest. A single person standing holding a single protest sign is considered to be a riot in Moscow. And yet, the Russian people, by the thousands, still took to the streets today to say, no, they can't bear it. They cannot bear him starting this war. And so far, Europe and the rest of the Western world has been quite unified, surprisingly unified in its response to Putin's aggression toward Ukraine. If you were going to be critical of lots of things about the Biden administration right now, uniting the world against what Putin is doing here is not something that you can criticize them from. They have pulled that off. But it's not that it won't be challenged. This mounting refugee crisis, which we started to see take shape today, it does have the potential to destabilize some of that unification, right? The strain of widespread humanitarian disaster, the need of other nations around the Ukraine crisis to adapt, to essentially come to the rescue, that creates political, diplomatic, ultimately economic difficulties. That coalition is mission critical right now for any chance of countering Russia's blitz through Ukraine. How do you retain that unity as we start to see these challenges build almost immediately as soon as the missiles started flying? Joining us now is former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. He was in that role, ambassador, when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014. Ambassador McFaul, it's really good to see you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really glad you're able to be here.
Glad to be here, Rachel. Welcome back.
Thank you. Let me just ask you first for how you are feeling. How you, as somebody who's been watching this so closely, as somebody who has lived through a smaller version of this before, in terms of what happened in 2014, how are you feeling watching what's happening in Ukraine? What is your overall reaction to what Putin has done and what he's been able to pull off thus far?
Well, my first reaction is I'm incredibly sad. Rachel, I have lots of friends in Ukraine. Hundreds of people have trained in our various programs here at Stanford. I used to go there often. And when they started to attack last night, I was on various platforms talking to Ukrainians, some of them now rather prominent Ukrainians in government and other places. And it was terrifying to watch my friends react to what was going on. And for all the unity you just talked about, and it has been really remarkable unity that the Biden administration has put together, one of my friends said very pointedly, I can't believe we have to fight this. And then she used a word I'm not going to use on TV. It begins with B, alone. And Ukrainians are alone. Despite all those things, all the solidarity, at the end of the day, Ukrainians are driving to Lviv. They're picking up weapons. They're in metro stations alone. They are fighting Russia alone. So that's my first reaction. My second reaction is anger. I want to tell you honestly, I am angry at this evil act by this evil leader attacking an innocent nation, a democratic nation, and he's attacking them because they are a democratic nation. That's what this is about. He is trying to undermine what the Ukrainians called the revolution of dignity back in 2014. He has been angry about it ever since, Vladimir Putin, and he said it very bluntly. I listened to his speech. He said it very bluntly. We're going to go in to do two things. One, to destroy the Ukrainian military, and two, to denazify. That was the word he used. Of course, that's not the right word. There's no Nazis ruling Ukraine. But what he means by that is he's going in to overthrow Mr. Zelensky and his regime. And there's intelligence reports that they're going to round up and arrest and perhaps kill the people that were the peaceful protesters that launched that Maidan revolution, that revolution of dignity back in 2013, 2014. So I'm angry about that.
The way you're describing that and those historical references, I think, to me, have been lining up in a way that raises one very big question, right? When we saw in 2008, when Putin waged war against Georgia, we saw him denounce the leader of Georgia as a Nazi. I remember they hacked the website of the Georgian leader, Georgian president, and put up all these pictures of him looking like Hitler, right? Trying to create this case that he's some sort of Nazi, just like they're making that preposterous case about President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government today. You were in Russia as ambassador when he took and annexed, when he invaded and took Crimea and took other portions of eastern Ukraine in 2014. And I remember, in 2008, I remember John McCain running for president saying, we are all Georgians now, and talking about the unity that brought, the rejection of that aggression from Putin brought not only to the Americans on all sides of the political system, but to the entire West. I remember the international outrage in 2014 when Putin did what he did. And I remember the sanctions, not only from the United States, not only from the European Union, but from a unified Western field of sanctions that really bit in Russia in terms of making real economic consequences. And yet here he is again. And this time, maybe he's going to try to take all of Ukraine. And who knows how long he's going to try to hold it for, if not permanently. It feels like sanctions is the big idea from the West, and the sanctions are getting tougher, and there will be, I imagine, even more announced in further days. But it feels like that's sort of baked in to Putin's calculations at this point, that he doesn't think that sanctions are important enough to stop him from doing anything he wants to do. And yet it seems like it's the strongest weapon that gets wielded against him.
That's right. We talk a lot about sanctions because that's the instrument we're willing to use. There are other instruments that we're not willing to use. I think rightly, by the way, I agree with President Biden, but that means we focus on that. And I think we make a miscalculation when we talk about sanctions. And I want to be crystal clear. I support what the president announced today. I would go farther. If he wants to do 100% sanctions, I want to do 110. And I hope there's more to come. At the same time, we need to be realistic and understand that this is a dictatorship in Russia. Sanctioning banks, I know the two heads of the banks that were sanctioned today. They're not going to go in and tell Vladimir Putin, hey, you better stop your war because my bank was sanctioned. You know why? Because they're the leaders of those banks because Putin put them there. I think that's an important thing for people to understand. He controls that economy. So we were not going to see the consequences of pressure on Putin for, I predict, months, if not years to come from these sanctions. So it's the right thing to do. There has to be a response, but let's have no illusions that this is going to change his calculus, at least in the short run.
On that last point there is a sort of common wisdom about sanctions that you don't sanction directly the rogue state leader. You don't sanction the dictator personally. And you saw the president today sort of fending off and not addressing, not answering questions from a lot of different reporters as to why Putin personally wouldn't be targeted with sanctions. The common wisdom for why you don't do that is because once you've sanctioned them, that essentially precludes the possibility of negotiating anything with them, of talking to them about anything. And in this case, however this is going to be resolved, it's going to have to be resolved through some sort of conversation. So you need to leave open a door to have a conversation. At some point, does Putin become a person who doesn't get talked to? At some point, does the door to sanctioning him personally become a more important essentially tactic to use than keeping open the prospect of talking to him, essentially given what's happened with previous conversations and commitments that he's given up in the past?
Well, Rachel, you're absolutely right about why our nation, our administration and governments, Democrats and Republicans, don't like to sanction the head of state because they want to leave open the possibility to meet. I respect that. I think it's more symbolic than real, but I do think it underscores something else. Is we've got to start calling, you just used the rogue state, pariah state. Those are the right terms to talk about Russia today. Tragically, Putin has transformed the state of Russia into those things, and we've got to treat him that way in many different shapes and forms, not just in this moment, but across the board. Isolate him. Don't engage him. Don't pretend we're business as usual after this war is over. And we've got to stand up to evil. Let's call it what it is. We've got to stand up. There is right and wrong in the world. There is good and evil in the world. My government and my country sometimes has been on the wrong side of those. Let's be honest about that. But in this case, there's right and wrong for those brave Ukrainians that are withstanding evil. We've got to be with them. And by the way, I'm glad you reported it earlier in your program. There also are brave Russians standing up. 1,700 were arrested today. 53 cities were there. Don't underestimate how unpopular this war is. They want to hear our voice being as strong. They were prepared to be arrested today. We need to show that we are going to be as strong in standing up for good versus evil.
Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Professor McFaul, it's always a pleasure to have you, but particularly tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.